My brother laughed before the lawyer reached page 2. He leaned back in front of 7 relatives, tapped the table twice, and said, "Well, that settles the sentimental part." The lawyer did not answer him or hurry to defend anyone. He simply placed one finger beneath the final line on the first sheet. Grant kept smiling as the page turned, unaware that the next words would test something much larger than who had spoken first. If you have ever watched someone mistake your silence for weakness, stay with me until the end, because what happened after page 2 was not a clean revenge scene. It was the kind of truth that arrived quietly, with dates, signatures, and just enough mercy to leave a family with something worth repairing. My name is Daniel Mercer. I was 39, and I worked as the inventory manager for a regional medical supply warehouse. Before that, I spent nearly every weekend of my adult life helping my father at Mercer Tool and Feed, the store my grandfather opened in 1968. I was the younger son, the one who could fix a register, reconcile a vendor bill, and stack seed bags without needing my name painted on the door. Let me back up. Mercer Tool and Feed sat at the edge of Willow Bend, beside a 2-lane road where farmers, contractors, and half the county stopped for nails, fencing staples, work gloves, and gossip. My grandfather started it with one delivery truck and a rented room behind a tire shop. My father, Leonard Mercer, bought the current building in 1987 and added the feed warehouse, the garden lot, and a narrow strip of land behind it that everybody later wanted because the highway plan made the road frontage valuable. The store was never glamorous. It smelled like dust, grass seed, coffee, and machine oil. The floor creaked in aisle 4, the office heater clicked through winter, and the sign above the door had faded from red to something closer to brick. But to Dad, the place was proof that a family could build something steady by doing ordinary work well. He used to tell me, "A legacy is not the biggest thing you own. It is the thing you are careful enough not to waste." My older brother Grant heard sentences like that and translated them into inheritance. He was 43, a sales manager at a construction supply company, and he carried himself like he had been born waiting for a title. When we were young, he loved telling people he would run the store someday. Dad never corrected him in public. He would only glance at me afterward with that tired look parents get when they are trying not to embarrass one child in front of another. The truth was more complicated. Grant had worked at the store for 4 summers in high school and 1 winter after college, but he hated the slow parts. He liked customers who praised the family name, not the ones who argued over a $6 hinge. He liked the idea of owning the place, not the discipline of staying until 8 at night during planting season because a neighbor's pump failed. I did not work there full-time either. Dad insisted I'd build my own career because he never wanted the store to become a cage. But after my mother died in 2014, I became the person he called when the tax file was missing, when the payroll software froze, when the delivery driver quit, or when he needed someone to sit with him after closing and say nothing. I did the unglamorous work because he asked, and because the store still smelled like my mother's coffee at 6 in the morning. Mom had been the keeper of order. She handled books, payroll, and the quiet, emotional labor of making Grant feel important without letting him make decisions. When she died, Dad found a note in her desk that said, "Do not let the boys divide the store while they are still grieving me." He folded it into his wallet and carried it until the corners softened. That note became the reason his true plan stayed quiet. In 2018, after a minor stroke left his left hand weak for 3 months, Dad met with an attorney named Mr. Sutter and created the Mercer Legacy Trust. He transferred the store building, the road frontage, the house, and the 12 acres into the trust. The operating shares of the family company went into the same plan, with the provision that no sale, mortgage, or leadership change could happen for 24 months after his death unless the trustee approved it. Dad named me successor trustee and gave me voting control of the company's shares during that 24-month period. Grant would receive a cash distribution, a future beneficiary interest, and the chance to work for the company under a written management agreement if he accepted the trust terms. If he contested the plan or tried to transfer assets without authority, his cash distribution would be held until the court resolved the challenge. I told Dad that Grant would see it as betrayal. Dad was sitting at the kitchen table, practicing his signature with a thick pen, because the stroke had changed his hand. He looked at the old photograph of Mom beside the stove and said, "Your brother thinks being oldest is a job description. Your mother knew better." "Then tell him," I said. Dad shook his head. "If I tell him now, he will perform respect until I die. I want to know what is real." I hated that answer because I understood it. Grant's affection often came wrapped around expectation. He took Dad to lunch when he wanted the store records. He visited on Sundays when he wanted to walk the road frontage. He spoke warmly about family when a decision was coming. Dad wanted his last years to show him who loved him without a prize in sight. The day he signed the trust, Dad asked me to drive him to the store before we went home. Mr. Sutter had given him a blue folder with copies, and Dad held it against his chest like it was heavier than paper. We stopped at Mercer Tool and Feed just after closing, when the aisles were quiet and the late sun made dust shine over the seed bins. Ruth was still at the register, counting a drawer, and she looked up as if she already knew something serious had happened. Dad asked her to make coffee, which meant he needed a minute to gather himself. Then he took me to the back office and opened the folder on the desk. He did not show me every page, but he pointed to the recorded deed, the company resolution, and the trustee clause. His finger trembled a little over my name. "This is not a crown," he said. "I know. Say it back to me." "It is not a crown. It is a broom, a lockbox, and a promise," he said. "Most days, that is what ownership really is." Ruth came in with the coffee and pretended not to see my eyes. Dad asked her to witness a company resolution, acknowledging that voting control would follow the trust, and she read every line before signing. That was Ruth. She trusted Dad, but she still read paper. When she finished, she said, "Leonard, this will make Grant furious." Dad looked toward the front door, where the old bell hung still. "Then I hope he waits long enough to become ashamed of it." That scene stayed with me because it showed me Dad was not naive. He knew the plan would hurt Grant's pride. He also knew pride was not the same as harm, and he refused to confuse the two just because the loudest person might accuse him of unfairness. The first small overreach came 8 months before Dad died. He had begun using a cane, and I had started driving over every Wednesday night to help with invoices. One evening, I found Grant in the store office with a measuring tape and a sketch of the front counter. "What are you doing?" I asked. He did not look guilty. That was the thing about Grant. He rarely did. Thinking ahead. "This office is dead space. If we move the counter up front and lease the warehouse side, the place starts making real money. Dad is still using this office." Grant shrugged. "Dad is sentimental. Sentiment does not pay property tax." Dad was in the next room, close enough to hear. His cane tapped once against the floor. Grant lowered his voice and changed the subject, but the damage had already landed. Later, when I locked the front door, Dad stood beside me and said, "Some people look at a table and see what they can sell it for. Some remember who ate there." The second pressure thread came from Grant's wife, Mallory. She was polished, efficient, and better at sounding reasonable than Grant. She began calling my Aunt Beth, Dad's younger sister, to say the family needed unity. Aunt Beth was 66, recently widowed, and always frightened of conflict. Mallory told her Grant had a buyer interested in the road frontage and that delay could cost everyone real money. Aunt Beth called me one afternoon from her porch. "Mallory says your father promised Grant first chance at the store," she said. "Dad has not said that to me. She says you are making him dependent on you." I closed my eyes. "I drive him to appointments. That is not dependence." "I know," she whispered, "but she said if I do not support Grant, I will look like I am against the family." That was how Grant worked when direct pressure failed. He let Mallory turn fear into consensus. He pushed Aunt Beth because she wanted peace, and he treated peace as something people owed him. 2 months later, the overreach became harder to dismiss. Grant brought a business broker to the store without telling Dad. The broker walked through the feed warehouse, asked about annual revenue, and took photos of the backlot. I arrived with Dad's medication refill and found them beside the loading door. "Who is this?" I asked. Grant smiled as if I had interrupted a harmless errand. "A consultant." The broker extended his hand. "Just getting a preliminary feel for the asset." Dad heard the word asset and stepped out of the office. He looked smaller than he used to, but his voice did not. "This is my store, not a feel." Grant laughed lightly. "Dad, do not get dramatic. Nobody is signing anything today. Nobody invited him today," Dad said. The broker left within 5 minutes. Grant stayed behind, angry in the clean way he preferred, with his hands in his pockets and his jaw tight. "You cannot expect us to sit around forever while you let Daniel play caretaker and gatekeeper," he said. Dad said, "Daniel does not own the gate." Grant looked at me. "He just keeps the key in his pocket." That line was cruel because Dad had given me the store keys after Mom died, not as a symbol of power, as a practical thing. Someone had to open when he was sick, close when he was tired, and meet vendors when the delivery truck came early. Grant turned that quiet responsibility into suspicion, because suspicion served him. Dad died on a Monday at 2 in the afternoon, in the recliner by the living room window, with rain tapping the roof and a store invoice on the side table. He had been sorting receipts that morning because he hated loose ends. I was in the kitchen making soup he would not live to eat when he called my name softly. By the time I reached him, he was already looking past me, toward something I could not see. The funeral was 6 days later. Grant gave the eulogy and told everyone Dad had taught him leadership. He said the store would continue under family values, and several people nodded because they assumed oldest sons inherited not only property but narrative. I sat in the second row with Aunt Beth, listening to Grant speak over a life he had only visited in pieces. After the burial, Mallory asked whether I had begun compiling passwords, vendor lists, safe keys, and payroll records. I told her Mr. Sutter would guide the estate process. She smiled tightly. "Daniel, we are not turning a family store into a legal circus." "The estate already has legal documents," I said. "Of course it does," she replied. "But documents should support family, not replace it." That sounded generous until you understood she meant Grant. The will reading was scheduled for the following Friday at 10 in the morning. Mr. Sutter sent formal notices to me, Grant, Mallory as Grant's spouse for company notice purposes, Aunt Beth, the store bookkeeper named Ruth, and 2 small beneficiaries. Ruth had worked at Mercer Tool and Feed for 31 years. She knew more about the store than Grant ever had, and Dad had included her because he trusted her memory. Grant hated that. The night before the meeting, he called and told me not to bring employees into family business. I reminded him Ruth had received notice from the attorney, not from me. He said, "You always hide behind other people's paperwork." I almost told him the paperwork was the only reason the store would survive him. Instead, I said I would see him in the morning. At Mr. Sutter's office, Grant arrived in a navy suit and a red tie, too bright for grief. Mallory sat beside him with a leather folder and a calculator app open on her phone. Aunt Beth sat near the wall, folding a tissue into smaller and smaller squares. Ruth came in quietly and took the chair nearest the door. Mr. Sutter began with the usual formal language. He confirmed Dad's death certificate. The original will dated March 9, 2018, and the trust agreement executed the same day. Grant sighed loudly enough for everyone to hear. When Mr. Sutter read the first page, it sounded simple at first. Personal effects to be divided by agreement. Mom's jewelry to me for safekeeping until family distribution. Dad's watch to Grant. A $30,000 gift to Aunt Beth. A $207 retirement gift to Ruth. Grant smiled at the watch. Then Mr. Sutter read that Grant would receive Dad's fishing boat, the pickup truck, and the framed store sign from the original location. Grant let out a small laugh. "My brother laughed at the will," I said before I could stop myself. Grant looked at me, still smiling. "Because Dad knew who would actually use things, Daniel. Not everything is an emotional museum." Mallory touched his arm, but she was smiling too. Aunt Beth looked down. Ruth's mouth tightened. Then Grant leaned back and said the line from the hook. "Well, that settles the sentimental part." That was the breaking point. It was not the laugh alone. It was the ease of it, the way he treated Dad's last words as a warm-up before the assets he thought mattered. I felt heat climb my neck, but I remembered Dad at the kitchen table, practicing his signature and telling me Mom knew better. I remembered him saying, a legacy was the thing you were careful enough not to waste, so I did nothing dramatic. I folded my hands under the table. I let Grant enjoy the room for 20 more seconds. My quiet decision was to let page 2 arrive exactly the way Dad had designed it. Before the meeting, I had given Mr. Sutter the store keys, the latest inventory report, the vendor account list, and the trust ledger Dad kept in a gray binder. I had also told him about the broker visit and Mallory's calls to Aunt Beth. Mr. Sutter said he would read the documents in order and make a record of any objections. That was the action. No argument, no threat, no private warning to Grant. The will, trust, and company resolution were already in the attorney's file. The law did not need me to outshout my brother. It needed me to stay present while the right page was turned. For a moment, everything looked falsely calm. Grant sat back with his arms folded. Mallory wrote something in her folder. Mr. Sutter lifted the second page and paused to separate the sheets. I could hear the hum of the office lights and Aunt Beth's tissue tearing in her hands. Then the new complication surfaced before Mr. Sutter could read. Mallory slid a letter across the table and said, "For the record, Grant has a signed statement from Leonard indicating his intent to make Grant operating manager immediately upon death." Grant's smile returned. Dad wrote it after Daniel started acting like the store was his. Mr. Sutter unfolded the letter. I recognized Dad's handwriting at the top, but not the body. It was a photocopy of an old note from 2012, when Dad had asked Grant to cover the store for 1 week while I was away. Mallory had underlined the phrase, "Grant will manage things while I am gone." Mr. Sutter read it silently, then placed it beside the will. "This does not refer to death, ownership, voting shares, or the trust." Grant said, "It shows intent. It shows your father asked you to manage the store during a vacation 11 years ago." Ruth coughed once into her hand. Grant's face reddened. Then Mr. Sutter read page 2. "I direct that all real property and company interests previously transferred to the Mercer Legacy Trust shall be administered according to the trust terms. My son Daniel Mercer is nominated as successor trustee and shall hold voting control of Mercer Tool and Feed for a period of 24 months after my death. No sale, lease of substantial assets, mortgage, leadership transfer, or road frontage agreement may occur during that period without his written consent." No one moved. Mr. Sutter continued, "My son Grant Mercer may participate in management only by written agreement with the trustee, the company bookkeeper, and counsel, and only after accepting the trust terms in writing. Any beneficiary who attempts to transfer, encumber, or sell trust property without authority shall have discretionary distributions suspended pending court review." The room changed shape around those words. Grant's arms came unfolded. Mallory stopped writing. Aunt Beth looked up with wet eyes. Ruth closed hers briefly, like someone hearing a lock click into place. Grant said, "That cannot be right." Mr. Sutter placed the trust certification on the table. "It is right. Dad would not put Daniel over me. Your father put the trust over both of you," Mr. Sutter said. "Daniel administers it." Mallory's voice turned cold. "We need copies." "You will receive the required copies," Mr. Sutter said. "You will also receive notice that no buyer, broker, lender, or county office is to treat Grant as authorized to act for trust property." That was when the fallout became visible. Grant looked at me as if I had reached across the table and taken something from his hand. But the truth was worse for him. I had not taken anything. Dad had never placed it there. Aunt Beth began crying quietly. She kept whispering, "Leonard knew." Ruth asked whether the payroll account would continue without interruption, and Mr. Sutter said yes. Mallory asked if Grant could challenge the trust. Mr. Sutter said any beneficiary could seek legal advice, but the trust had been properly executed, the deed recorded, and Dad's physician had provided a capacity letter in 2018 after the stroke. Grant stood so fast his chair hit the wall. "This is what you wanted," he said to me. I looked at him. I wanted Dad alive. For once, he had no answer ready. After the meeting, Grant stormed out. Mallory followed, already on her phone. Aunt Beth stayed in the conference room shaking so badly that Ruth brought her water. Mr. Sutter asked me to remain for 10 minutes to sign the trustee acceptance. I signed where he pointed, each signature feeling less like power and more like weight. The reveal happened in the parking lot, with Ruth standing beside my truck. She had Dad's retirement gift letter folded in her purse and tears on her cheeks, though she kept wiping them away like they embarrassed her. "Daniel," she said, "how long did you know he named you?" "Since 2018. Not every detail, but enough." Why did he not tell Grant? He wanted to know whether Grant loved the store or the idea of taking it. Ruth looked toward the road, where Grant's car had just turned out of the lot. "Your father asked me once whether I would stay if you were trustee." "What did you say?" "I told him I would stay if you protected the people who work there, not just the walls." She looked back at me. He smiled and said, "That is why I am asking." I had to look away for a second. "I am scared, Ruth." "Good," she said. "People who are not scared of responsibility usually should not have it." That was the first time all day I almost laughed. Not because anything was funny, but because Ruth had a way of making truth sound like a receipt you could file. The turn came the next morning. Grant arrived at the store before opening with Mallory and a locksmith. He told the locksmith he was taking control for the family and needed the office lock changed. Ruth was already inside because she opened every Saturday. Instead of arguing, she called me, then Mr. Sutter, then walked to the front door and locked it from the inside. Grant pounded on the glass. Ruth opened the door. She stood behind the register and held up the notice Mr. Sutter had emailed the night before. "I have written instructions. You work for us." Ruth's voice carried through the glass. "I work for Mercer Tool and Feed. Right now, Daniel is authorized to act for the trust." Mallory said something I could not hear. Grant pointed toward the office. Ruth did not move. By the time I arrived, Mr. Sutter had already spoken to the locksmith by phone. The locksmith packed his tools and left without changing anything. Grant stood on the sidewalk, humiliated in the sharp morning light. Ruth came outside then, and this was the moment I will never forget. She looked at Grant and said, "Your father built this store by keeping promises. Do not make your first act after his funeral a broken one." Grant's face twisted. For a second, I thought he might shout. Instead, he got in his car and slammed the door hard enough to make the window rattle. The next 30 days were hard in the way paperwork is hard when grief keeps interrupting it. I opened a trust administration account, updated company signers, sent notices to vendors, and filed the trust certification with the county records office. Mr. Sutter drafted a letter to the business broker explaining that no sale or road frontage discussion was authorized. Mallory stopped calling Aunt Beth after Mr. Sutter copied her on a warning about beneficiary pressure. Mr. Sutter also asked me to meet him and Ruth at the store for a practical walkthrough. It was not ceremonial. It was fluorescent lights, clipboards, and the smell of feed dust in our clothes. We counted the cash drawer, checked the safe, photographed the office files, and listed every key on a yellow legal pad. There were 14 keys, including one to the back gate that Grant had claimed was missing for years. Ruth found it in a coffee tin behind the receipt books. "Your father kept keys like memories," she said. Mr. Sutter reminded me that trustee authority was not permission to act from anger. "You can protect the store," he said. "You cannot use the store to punish your brother." What if the only way to protect it feels like punishment to him? Then document the reason until the feeling is not the evidence, he said. That became my rule for the next year. Every decision needed a reason I could write down without embarrassment. If I denied Grant access to a bank account, I wrote that he was not an authorized signer. If I refused a broker call, I wrote that the trust barred sale discussions during the restricted period. If I kept Ruth in financial oversight, I wrote that continuity protected payroll and vendor credit. The reasons mattered because grief can make even a rightful heir dangerous if nobody asks him to explain himself. Grant did not speak to me for 18 days. Then Aunt Beth called and asked me to come to her house. She sounded nervous, so I went after work. Grant was there, sitting at her kitchen table in the same navy suit he had worn to the will reading, though now it looked rumpled. "I did not know he had a doctor's letter," Grant said without greeting. "He did. I thought you talked him into it after the stroke. You thought that because it made you less responsible for how you treated him." Aunt Beth inhaled sharply, but Grant did not leave. He stared at his hands. "Mallory found an attorney," he said. "He said challenging it would be expensive and probably ugly. He is right." Grant looked up. "Did Dad hate me?" That question did something to the room. It stripped away the sales voice, the oldest son posture, the laugh. For a second he was my brother at 10 years old, standing in the store aisle with a broken toy truck and waiting for Dad to fix it. "No," I said. "He left you his watch, the boat, the truck, the sign, and a path into the company if you accepted rules. Rules written by you. Rules written by you. Rules written by him." Grant rubbed both hands over his face. I laughed. Yes. I heard myself do it after. I kept hearing it. Aunt Beth reached across the table and touched his sleeve, then do something different next. That was the beginning of accountability, not the end. Grant signed the trust acceptance 2 weeks later, but he did not become manager. The written agreement gave him a 6-month trial role handling outside sales under Ruth's financial oversight and my trustee approval. He hated that at first. He said it made him look like an employee. Ruth said, "That is because you are one." To his credit, Grant stayed. He learned which customers paid late because their crops paid late, not because they were careless. He learned that the old delivery truck needed a gentle shift into second gear. He learned that Ruth could find a missing invoice by remembering the color of the customer's coat. He learned the store was not a throne. It was 100 small obligations arriving before breakfast. Mallory struggled more. She did not like the trustee reports, the spending limits, or the fact that Aunt Beth now called me directly when she felt pressured. But even she softened after Mr. Sutter explained that Grant's future share depended on cooperation, not control. Money did not make her kind, but structure made her careful, and careful was enough for a while. 6 months later, Grant asked to meet me at the store after closing. He stood in the office under the old calendar Dad never changed because it had Mom's handwriting on several dates. The room smelled like paper dust and coffee. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I waited, not just for the will reading, for bringing the broker, for making Dad feel like he had to defend his own store. The last part mattered. It was the first time he had named Dad as the person harmed, not just himself as the person disappointed. "I appreciate that," I said. Grant looked at the desk. I thought being oldest meant he saw me as next. Dad saw who stayed with the hard parts. "I know." He swallowed. "I want to earn a place here if you will let me." I thought of Dad saying the trust would slow people down long enough for kindness to catch up. I did not know yet whether Grant's kindness had caught up or just his fear. But the store had survived because Dad had made space for time. "We keep the agreement," I said. "No shortcuts." Grant nodded. "No shortcuts." By the end of the first year, he was still not running Mercer Tool and Feed, but he was working there. That distinction became important. Customers stopped asking when he would take over and started asking whether he could help load fencing. He did. Sometimes badly, sometimes late, but more often than I expected, he stayed until the job was done. When the 24-month restriction ended, I had the authority to recommend the next stage. I did not sell the road frontage. I renewed the store lease under the trust, gave Ruth a formal retirement option she refused because she said retirement sounded boring, and offered Grant a minority management role with quarterly review. He accepted without laughing. Aunt Beth hosted dinner the night we signed the new operating agreement. Grant wore Dad's watch. I brought Mom's old ledger because Ruth had found it in the bottom drawer and thought it belonged at the table. After dessert, Grant turned the watch over in his hand and said, "I thought the will gave me scraps." It gave you a mirror, Ruth said. He looked at her, then at me. I did not like what I saw. Nobody filled the silence for him. That was part of the repair, too. People need room to hear their own words. Our relationship did not become simple. Brothers do not undo decades with one signature and a few honest sentences. But he stopped calling the store mine or his. He started saying Dad's store, then the family store, and eventually just the store, which was the closest he had ever come to understanding it. On the second anniversary of Dad's death, we hung the framed original sign in the front office. Grant had wanted it at his house at first, because Page 1 gave it to him. Then he brought it back and said it belonged where customers could see it. We placed Dad's watch on the desk for the day, beside Mom's ledger and the trust binder. It looked less like a shrine than a reminder. Legacy is not proven by who laughs first, speaks loudest, or grabs the largest object from the table. It is proven by who can receive responsibility without turning it into entitlement, and who can let a document correct them without letting pride destroy what the dead tried to protect. My brother laughed at the will. Then the lawyer read page 2, and the legacy finally stopped laughing with him.